Growing up, my dad loved to call me God's kid. The reason why was because moments before my scheduled abortion, my mother felt something divine and holy moving within her, and she changed her mind.
She said later that it was God intervening. Never married and hardly a couple, my parents made their final split when I was 6 years old. That split marked the fragmentation of worlds that I would grow up in. At my dad's, it was common for a tweaker to drop by unannounced, coming down from meth and looking to score a bag of swag weed from my dad. At mom's, every Sunday, I'd be flanked by Pentecostals, speaking in tongues and detailing prophecies of the rapture. It's harder to imagine a starker contrast of realities to grow up in. But there's one thing that both of my parents consistently reflected to me. I was God's kid. The Pentecostals scared me more than the meth heads did. They projected vivid scenes of eternal hell into my developing psyche. Before I'd hit puberty, I had already internalized graphic images of my mother's 2 back alley abortions. They were heartbreaking stories. In her words, they were the biggest regrets of her life. The messages I received about abortion is that nobody, under any circumstance, should be able to have one. That abortion is a sin, punishable by God, something a woman regrets for the rest of her life and pays for the rest of her life. My takeaway? Well, if God hadn't rescued me, I would have been an abortion. So abortions are bad. And I could never, ever, ever, ever have an abortion. When I was 17 years old, one of my best friends got pregnant. Her family was Mormon. And in a trance of deep shame, self-hate, and denial, she was bootlegging DIY miscarriage cocktails of Robitussin, Boone's Hill wine, Mad Dog 2020, and cigarettes. She said she was desperate to have an abortion. So I agreed to help her find a safe one. And for us, that was a 4-hour drive away. But that is another story. But what I learned through that process is that women should be able to access safe and legal abortions. 5 years later, I was a senior in college. I felt on top of the world. I was thriving in academics and leadership, and I had just fallen in love with my crush, a sweet, sensitive artist and musician named Ben. But 2 months into our relationship, God's kid got pregnant. At that point in my life, I had become a champion and advocate for other women's rights. I worked at the Women's Resource Center on campus. I volunteered at the local women's domestic violence shelter. But somehow, I was unable to advocate and create space for myself in this arena. Mortified by my reality and guilt petrified, I decided to confess to my father. Not Almighty God, but my dad, Ray, a guy with a pot belly and an insatiable love for cannabis, Coca-Cola, and Little Debbie's coffee cakes. I started bawling as soon as I heard his voice pick up the phone. He was emphatic in telling me, "Kid, you have a choice. You're not the same person we were." And on one level, he convinced me. But I remained viscerally terrified of eternal punishment, damnation, condemnation by God for undermining my existence. But I wasn't ready to be a mom. And adoption was off the table because Ben did not want to release a child into the world that he wasn't going to care for and bring up himself. So, flanked with fear, but with my father's blessing, I scheduled an abortion. Ben drove me to my appointment. It was a bright and chilly fall morning. Outside, there were deciduous trees whose vivid leaves were igniting the day, singing colorful choruses of color before letting go of their branches to die. I imagined God was going to drop me like that. I would be cast off like one of those scarlet leaves left to rot under the snow. God's going to leave me. I arrived to the doctor's office and took in the boring brown room around me. As I laid down on the table, I felt my body clenching and wincing. As the procedure began, I began to repeat a silent mantra in my mind. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But what I felt, what I experienced, was God coming into that room. I felt a holy presence showing up at a time that I was walking straight off a cliff. I was soothed and super confused as a wave of peace washed over me. It was as if the sun had risen into that office and was illuminating the walls of this boring brown room, illuminating the walls of my heart. 7 years later, I stood there, shaking my head as I watched 2 bright red lines come into focus on my 3rd consecutive positive pregnancy test. This time with Ocean, a man-child 4 years younger than me. At this point in my life, bringing a baby into the world was an absolute no way. But this information awoke something inside of him that made him want to step into manhood. He wanted to be a dad. I could not believe this predicament. But I believed that abortion had to be a decision that was arrived to by both parties consensually. So I repressed, I pushed down my resistance, and we stumbled forward with the pregnancy. We told our parents. His mother accused me of trying to trap her son. My dad, more sympathetically, offered maybe we could buy a trailer, park it on his land, and have the baby there. Conjuring up this image made me want to crawl into a corner and die. Months later, Ocean stumbled home, very late, very drunk, and crawled in bed on top of me, sneering and daring me to go ahead and get an abortion. I pushed him off me, and when I ran to the stairs, he dragged me down them by my ankles. He had lost his vote. The next morning, I called my dad, and the next call after that was to a local clinic. Now, well into my 2nd trimester, I cursed myself for not listening to my gut sooner. Everybody knew about my pregnancy, including my mom. I fell into a familiar trance of deep shame, self-hatred, and denial. But when I arrived to my appointment, I was met by a stream of women whose compassion was able to begin to thaw the icy layers of self-punishment I had trapped myself under. As I was getting prepped for the 2-part, 2-day procedure, one woman said something to me that shook me from my trance. She told me the choice I was making was a loving choice. That had not occurred to me. For a 2nd trimester abortion, I would be given an anesthetic. I woke up alone in a light-filled room, the morning sunlight streaming onto my bed, and God was there. A divine, holy presence letting me know that I really was not alone. I put on my clothes. I felt calm. I felt a compassion wash over me. I walked out onto the street. I found my car. I found Ocean sleeping in it. And I rapped hard on the windshield, jolting him awake. As he said nothing and rubbed his sleepy eyes on the drive home, I knew, indeed, with every cell of my being, that I had made the loving choice. I lied to my mom and told her I had a miscarriage. I lied to her to protect me, because these were not choices that I was going to regret. These were choices that had restored my right to my precious life. I have had 2 abortions. After I met and married the love of my life, my husband Stuart, I wanted to be pregnant. And then I had 2 miscarriages. But I didn't interpret my miscarriages to be punishment by God. My dad had passed away earlier that year, and I knew I was still grieving the enormous loss that his death had created in my life. I trusted the intelligence of my body, and I did things to support it. In 2012, we were living in Malaysia, and I felt ready, and my body felt ready. And together, we co-created a pregnancy consciously. I birthed my baby boy with no pain meds and no epidurals. I didn't take the meds because I wanted to stay awake and connected and present to each lull, jolt, pain, and pleasure of the process. But after 35 hours of hard-ass labor, I was exhausted. I surrendered. I sunk my body deep into the birthing pool until only my nostrils peeked out of the water. I went deep into my body and I found that little life inside of me. And I whispered to it, "Okay, baby, I will follow you." The arrival of our son was so outrageously holy that my thoroughly atheist and sweet, adorable husband, Stuart, was bowled over and bewildered by the divinity of our son's arrival. The decision to become a mother has been the greatest choice, the greatest joy, and the greatest job of my life. I thank God that I was ready and resourced to step into this beautiful, beautiful privilege. And what I know is that I will always be God's child, because we are all unconditionally God's children. And I thank God for safe, compassionate, and legal abortion providers. Thank you.